As Italy joined the Axis powers on June 10, 1940, its navy, the Regia Marina, had 2 battleships ready for combat. 2 more were finishing reconstruction, and 2 new ships were getting ready for service. From June 1940 to September 1943, 7 battleships would serve with the Regia Marina, with 5 surviving the war. This episode will cover the Conte di Cavour, Andrea Doria, and Vittorio Veneto classes. I'll give a surface-level summary of the classes, service history, and fates of each of the battleships, so let's jump in. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, the oldest battleships in their navy were the Conte di Cavour class. 3 battleships were originally in the class, Conte di Cavour, Giulio Cesare, and Leonardo da Vinci, which were completed between 1914 and 1915, an improvement on the original Italian dreadnought, Dante Alighieri. Designed in 1908, the Cavours focused on valuing speed over protection and armament. This class was considered outdated by the time they entered service. They saw little action during World War I, and unfortunately, Leonardo da Vinci suffered a magazine explosion in August 1916 and sank in Taranto harbor. She was later raised in 1919 and eventually scrapped in 1923. In 1928, the 2 Cavours remaining were placed in reserve. In 1932, France started construction on their 2 Dunkirk-class battleships, which prompted a new Italian battleship class to counter the French. As this was designed, a stopgap plan was implemented, where it was controversially decided to rebuild and modernize Conte di Cavour and Giulio Cesare. In 1933, both ships started their major reconstructions, with 40% of their original ships remaining. When built, their armament consisted of 13 12-inch Model 1909 guns, housing 3 triple turrets and 2 twin superfiring turrets, with the 3rd triple turret placed midway on the ship. Secondary armament consisted of 18 4.7-inch guns and casemates and 14 3-inch guns. During reconstruction, the middle 12-inch gun turret was removed, and the remaining 10 main guns were rebored to 12.59 inches to fire a heavy shell. Turret elevation increased to 27 degrees to shoot 31,000 yards. Secondary armament was replaced and upgraded, installing 6 twin 4.7-inch guns, 4 twin 3.9-inch anti-aircraft guns, and various light anti-aircraft weaponry. The hulls were lengthened to 611 feet 7 inches, more than 33 feet longer than the original, and fitted with a new bow. 8 superheated oil-fired boilers produced 75,000 shaft horsepower, which brought top speed up to 28 knots from the original 21.5 knots. Armor protection was considerably improved, adding 3,200 tons, most of which was for improving horizontal armor. Underwater protection was also a major part of the reconstructions, with the new Pugliese system installed, however, not the full intended system due to space restrictions. I'll cover more on the Pugliese system when discussing the Vittorio Veneto class. The reconstruction of the Conte di Cavour and Giulio Cesare were completed by late 1937. Even updated, the 2 ships were improvements from their original design, but still not as potent as contemporaries. When Italy went to war against the Allies in June 1940, these were the only 2 battleships ready for action. On July 14, 1940, they would see their first combat of the war against the British in the action off Calabria, known by the Italians as the Battle of Punta Stille. Along with a large escorting force, the battleships covered a convoy safely to Benghazi, and then engaged a British surface force of 3 battleships, an aircraft carrier, cruisers, and destroyers. A shell hit Giulio Cesare on one of her smokestacks, causing a fire, with smoke entering the engine rooms, causing her and the rest of the force to abandon the action. Fixed by the end of August, Giulio Cesare joined her sister to engage the British on multiple occasions over the next few months, with no avail. On November 11, 1940, the 6 Italian battleships in service were in port at Taranto. The Royal Navy, taking advantage of the lack of torpedo nets in the harbor and with no radar to warn the Italians, sent 21 torpedo bombers from the carrier Illustrious on a daring surprise raid. We'll cover what happened to each of the ships in their respective class sections. Conte di Cavour was hit by a torpedo behind her 2nd turret on the port side. The ship started flooding and was not grounded in time, where she sank in the shallow harbor, killing 27 crew and injuring more than 100. Her war was over. She was raised in June 1941 and later sent to Trieste, where on September 10, 1943, she was scuttled in the shipyard after Italy surrendered on September 8th. The Germans would raise Cavour once again, but a U.S. bombing raid sank her again in early 1945. and she was later broken up from 1950 to 1952. Giulio Cesare would be spared of any damage during the Taranto raid. As the lone survivor of the class, she was sent out to sea with the new battleship Vittorio Veneto twice later in the month in an attempt to intercept British convoys. Both skirmishes were largely inconclusive. Damaged in early January 1941 by an air raid in Naples, Giulio Cesare was back in service by early February. The rest of the year was quiet for her, either escorting convoys or going out to sea to engage British ships, where she once was able to during the First Battle of Sirte in mid-December with little results. From February 1942 onwards, Giulio Cesare was pulled from duty and in 1943 used as a training ship. When Italy surrendered in September 1943, she, along with the other remaining battleships left in port, made their way to Malta to be interned. During the trip, she fought off a mutiny and German air attacks with no damage. She was interned in Malta until June 1944, where she was sent back to Taranto. Years after the war ended, in February 1949, Giulio Cesare was given to the Soviet Union as war reparations. Refit multiple times and used as a training ship, she met her end in late October 1955. An unexpected explosion rocked the ship at anchor in Sevastopol, killing more than 600 men as she capsized. In 1911, as the Cavours were still under construction, the Regia Marina ordered 2 more battleships. The Andrea Doria class, also referred to as the Duilio class by Italian sources, were a slight improvement to the Cavours. Consisting of Andrea Doria and Duilio, the main differences from the Cavours were a slightly different armor protection scheme and an updated secondary armament. The ships featured 16 6-inch guns, 19 3-inch guns, and were built with 2 submerged 17.7-inch torpedo tubes. Both laid down in 1912, Duilio was completed in May 1915 and Andrea Doria in June 1916, and they did not see any action during World War I. With both Cavours put into reserve in 1928, Andrea Doria and Duilio were the only 2 Italian battleships in service and would be taken in and out of service throughout the years. In 1937, both were to be modified, similar to the previous 2 Cavour-class ships. The midship triple turret, superstructure, torpedo tubes, all secondary, and anti-aircraft guns were removed. More armor was added to the ships, like what was done with the Cavours, along with a modified Pugliese anti-torpedo protection system, as the ships were not able to equip the full system. 8 new oil-fired boilers gave them 75,000 shaft horsepower and enabled a 27-knot top speed. The remaining 10 12-inch guns were rebored to 12.59 inches, and the ships received a secondary armament of 4 triple 5.3-inch turrets, 2 per side located near the superstructure. For anti-aircraft protection, Andrea Doria and Duilio were fit with 10 3.5-inch enclosed guns for long range, 6 twin 37mm guns for mid-range protection, and 8 twin 20mm guns for closer ranges. The ships were also lengthened, similar to the Cavour class. Duilio re-entered service in July 1940, while Andrea Doria came back to service in October. On November 11, 1940, both ships were in port at Taranto the night the British air raid occurred. Duilio was vulnerable, as she was the battleship berthed to the farthest north, and would be hit by a torpedo on the starboard side, near turret 2. With the forward magazines flooding, she was pushed by support ships to shallower water to avoid sinking in a deeper spot. She was repaired, refloated in January 1941, and sent to Genoa for more serious repairs, and back in service in July 1941. Andrea Doria was spared of any damage during the attack and would sortie a few more times after the attack to engage the British with no success. Other than leaving port to escort convoys and look for the Royal Navy, 1941 was a quiet year for Andrea Doria, as well as for Duilio, until December. By mid to late 1941, the war in the Mediterranean shifted to convoy escort and warfare, with both the Royal Navy and Regia Marina sending heavy ships to protect freighters to their respective forces' ports. On December 17th, Andrea Doria and Duilio were part of the convoy escort from Italy to Benghazi in Libya, and Andrea Doria would fire her guns in anger against a British convoy and their escort during the First Battle of Sirte. This action was seen as inconclusive, even with the Regia Marina escorting force causing a few fatalities and damage to 2 British destroyers. Into the early months of 1942, both battleships continued escorting convoys in sorties to intercept British convoys and naval vessels. By mid-1942, both Andrea Doria and Duilio were taken out of service due to severe fuel shortages and would not be active into 1943. When Italy surrendered in September 1943, both ships went to Malta, where the Royal Navy interned the ships and gave them back in June 1944. Both Andrea Doria and Duilio were inactive and eventually used as training ships well after the war into the mid-1950s, and both were scrapped in the late 1950s. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 did not affect Italy as much as other world powers, which limited the Regia Marina to 175,000 tons of battleships, which they were well under. Italy was permitted to build new battleships, but used their naval budget mainly for cruisers in the late 1920s. The Regia Marina did have battleship concepts put together during this time. In 1931, as the Italians learned the French Navy had two new battleships on the way, which were the Dunkirk-class ships laid down in 1932, the Regia Marina quickly re-evaluated the heavy battleship concept started in the late 1920s. A 35,000-ton ship with 6 16-inch guns and 3 twin turrets was proposed, but this quickly fell out of favor. A ship with 9 15-inch guns and 3 triple turrets was decided as the armament layout. To shorten the design period of the ship, the Italians would modify a 15-inch gun design originally intended for the 4 canceled Francesco Caracciolo class battleships laid down during World War I and were never completed. Fitting what the Regia Marina wanted within a 35,000-ton ship was an issue. With permission from naval authorities in Italy, the Regia Marina decided to forego the Washington Naval Treaty and London Naval Treaty 35,000-ton battleship limit, and designed a ship with a displacement of 40,000 tons. Designated as a Vittorio Veneto class, also known as the Littorio class, it consisted of 4 ships: Vittorio Veneto, Littorio, Roma, and Impero. Vittorio Veneto and Littorio were laid down on October 28, 1934, and completed in early 1940, entering service together in August 1940. Roma and Impero were laid down in 1938. Roma was completed in June 1942, and Impero was never completed. Impero was captured by the Germans, sunk by the Allies in 1945, refloated in 1947, and scrapped a few years later. Coming in at 780 feet long, and with a beam of 108 feet, these were the largest Italian battleships. Fitting what they wanted into the new tonnage, to put it simply, the Regia Marina had a ship with good guns, decent armor protection, and better than average speed. The main battery consisted of 9 guns and 3 triple turrets, which used a 15-inch 50 caliber M1934 gun. With max elevation of 35 degrees, the gun could fire around 46,000 yards. Along with the main guns, the class featured a secondary armament of 12 6-inch 55 caliber guns and 4 triple turrets, 2 on each beam, which shared the barbettes of main turrets 1 and 3. For anti-aircraft protection, long-range weaponry were 12 3.5-inch guns. Intermediate protection was 20 37mm guns, 8 in twin mounts, and 4 in disappearing single mounts. Light anti-aircraft protection were 16 20mm guns. Armor protection was good all around at the time of the design. However, it is noted that even though the horizontal deck armor was heavy for the time period, it was not deemed sufficient enough in comparison to new battleships during World War II. The class design also focused on underwater protection, a first for the Italian battleships. Featured was the new Pugliese underwater protection system, which mainly consisted of an exterior belt which was angled against 2 interior longitudinal bulkheads, which created a circular cylinder. The semicircular void shape created around the cylinder acted as a shock absorber for any torpedo damage. The void space could be filled with water, oil, or fuel, and when attacked, the armored cylinder would collapse on itself, dissipating any force and keeping it away from the main hull of the ship. With 8 boilers and 4 sets of turbines, the class pushed 130,000 shaft horsepower, allowing the ships to reach 30 knots, though during the war with a full displacement, the ships could reach 29 knots. During trials in 1939 of Vittorio Veneto and Littorio, the bulbous bow design caused vibrations in the hull, heavy spray, and flooding of the forecastle. Roma, still being built at the time, was lengthened 5 feet and had a flared bow to minimize this problem. Impero, when launched, received the same modification, but would never be completed, making Roma the only one of the 3 in service to have the modification. The ships were also designed to carry aircraft, however, with no hangar accommodations. Originally, Vittorio Veneto and Littorio carried 3 RO-43 floatplanes, and then later, all 3 ships carried 2 unmodified RE-2000 fighters, which were able to launch from the ships but needed to return to an airfield after. As Vittorio Veneto and Littorio entered service in August 1940, the newest Italian battleships were quickly pressed into action on the hunt for Royal Navy warships. Although sortied many times in the following months with a number of close calls for combat, the 2 ships had no success in engaging warships or convoy vessels. On November 11th, during the attack on Taranto, both ships in service were in the harbor, with Vittorio Veneto spared of any torpedo strikes from the Royal Navy Swordfish torpedo bombers. Littorio, though, was not as lucky. She was struck 3 times in the 2 waves, once near her forward main turret on the starboard side, her port quarter, and then her starboard bow. Sinking rapidly, she was grounded in shallower waters to save her from being a total loss. Vittorio would be worked on, patched up, floated, and repaired by mid-March 1941, getting back into service by June. Vittorio Veneto would sortie with the aging Giulio Cesare twice during November to intercept British convoys. On March 28, 1941, Vittorio Veneto and her escorts engaged a fleet of 3 British battleships, an aircraft carrier, and escort vessels, known as the Battle of Cape Matapan. Firing her main guns without getting any hits, Vittorio Veneto avoided a wave of Royal Navy torpedo bombers. However, during the second wave, will be hit by a torpedo on the port quarter, damaging port propeller shafts and causing flooding. She was able to limp to safety. By August 1941, Vittorio Veneto was repaired and was joined again by her sister Vittorio, with the goal of intercepting British convoys supplying Malta in the following months. The ships were also used to protect Italian convoys to Africa, as the Italian situation became more desperate as well. On December 13th, both new battleships escorted a convoy to Tripoli. However, it was forced to turn back due to British submarines sinking freighters. Vittorio Veneto was torpedoed off the coast of Italy, hit near the port quarter once again. She would take on water, but would limp home, and was repaired by June 1942. Vittorio was part of the battleship force escorting an 8-ship convoy to Africa, while the British were escorting a convoy to Malta, with the 2 fleets clashing. Taking place at night, the first Battle of Sirte on December 17th was inconclusive, with Vittorio and the older battleships firing on British warships at range with no real luck. On March 22, 1942, Vittorio took part in the Second Battle of Sirte. As the British became even more desperate to supply Malta, an important convoy was engaged by Vittorio and her escorts. Vittorio's guns managed to hit 2 destroyers and a cruiser and force British warships back. She was hit by a 4.7-inch shell, and a blast from her third main turret lit one of her aircraft on fire as well. Though the Italians weren't able to score any hits on the convoy itself, the convoy dispersed, leaving them open to Axis air attacks the next day. With Vittorio Veneto back in action in June, she joined Vittorio and a supporting force to hunt a large British convoy headed to Malta on the 14th of the month. However, the Italians would be swarmed by Allied aircraft the next day, with Vittorio's turret being hit by a bomb from an American B-24, with no real damage done. Her luck ran out later on, getting hit by a torpedo on the forward starboard side by a British bomber. Roma, the newest ship of the class, entered trials in June as fuel shortages were severely limiting battleship operations. As noted earlier, all other Italian battleships were placed in reserve in mid-1942 and taken out of action by the end of the year, leaving only the 3 newest ships operational, being used only in critical actions due to the shortages. Notably, late in 1942, these were the only Italian battleships to receive radar sets. Italian battleships would not see any offensive actions for the rest of the war. During 1943, while all 3 of the class were in port, they would be hit on various occasions by Allied bombers, none too seriously damaged, and then repaired. Even as the Allies landed on Sicily in July 1943, Roma and Vittorio were available, but not used to fight the invasion force. Vittorio was renamed Italia on July 30th, after Mussolini's government fell, as her original namesake was a symbol of the party in power. On September 8, 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies. The following day, the Regia Marina ordered its battleships to Allied ports for internment. The 3 sisters sailed together in an attempt to reach Malta, but Germany saw Italian battleships handed over to the Allies as a liability. North of the island of Sardinia, the 3 sisters were caught by German Dornier 217 bombers with new radio-controlled Fritz X bombs. Essentially an early guided missile, the bombs were dropped on these capital ships. Vittorio Veneto was spared, and Italia was hit on the starboard side behind the first main turret, survived the hit, and continued to Malta. The newest battleship, Roma, on the other hand, would meet her end this day. A bomb hit her starboard side, went through the torpedo protection system, and exploded under the hull. The second bomb proved fatal. This would hit near the main turret on the port side, likely detonating in the forward main magazine. Fires from the magazine would blow the second main turret out of the barbette and overboard. Roma started listing and would never recover, capsizing soon after. 1,253 of her 1,869-man crew would be killed due to her sinking. After the 2 remaining of the class made it to Malta, they were interned and moved to Alexandria and then the Suez Canal in 1944. Vittorio Veneto was returned to Italy in 1946, but was given to Great Britain as a war prize. She was slated for disposal and scrapped from 1948 to 1950. Italia was given back to Italy in February 1947, and a few days later handed over to the US as a war prize. She was sent to scrap in 1948. I hope you enjoyed this video about Italian battleships of World War II. More content is coming out soon.